Imagine a kingdom where honor is law, where the strongest warriors kneel not to a king, but to a higher code, one of justice, loyalty, and courage. Imagine a court where knights do not fight for glory alone, but for something greater than themselves, something that could outlast them. That was Camelot. But dreams like these rarely last. It began with Arthur, a boy who pulled a sword from stone and became king. It flourished with the Knights of the Round Table, warriors who swore to defend the weak and uphold the ideals of chivalry. But legends are fragile, and men, even those who wear crowns and wield swords, are flawed. This is a tale of triumphs and failures, oaths and betrayals, a tale of brotherhood, love, war, and ruin. A dream that could not last forever. This is the story of the Knights of the Round Table, Camelot's sacred brotherhood. Britain was a land without a ruler, a kingdom without a future. For years, warlords had fought over the land, each claiming their right to rule, while the Saxons pillaged and burned whatever lay in their path. The once great realm was crumbling, and no single leader had the strength or the divine right to unite it. Then came Arthur. He was born from the schemes of Merlin and the obsession of a king. His father, Uther Pendragon, desired Lady Igraine, the wife of Duke Gorlois of Cornwall. But Igraine was beyond his reach, until Merlin offered Uther a terrible bargain. With his magic, Merlin disguised Uther as Gorlois for a single night, deceiving Igraine and conceiving a son destined to rule. That child was Arthur. Merlin took the infant Arthur and placed him in the care of Sir Ector, a noble knight, far from the dangers of court. For years, Arthur grew up as a simple squire, knowing nothing of his birthright. He trained beside Sir Kay, his foster brother, learning the ways of knighthood without any idea that he was the son of a king. Then fate intervened. The sword in the stone appeared, a relic embedded in an anvil, inscribed with a single promise. "Whoso pulleth out this sword of this stone is rightwise king born of England." One by one, the mightiest lords and knights attempted to free the sword, but none could move it. And then came Arthur. Some say it was an accident, that he pulled the sword only because Sir Kay needed a weapon for a tournament. Others believe it was destiny, that the blade recognized him before he even recognized himself. But when he drew the sword from the stone, Arthur was no longer a nameless squire. He was the true king of Britain. However, Arthur did not want to rule through fear. He had seen too many kings fall because they held power like a clenched fist. Too many rulers betray their own oaths for the sake of their crowns. He dreamed of something different, a realm where knights fought not for themselves, but for justice. A kingdom where the strong did not prey upon the weak. And so Camelot was born, a city unlike any other, a fortress of stone and splendor where kings and knights stood side by side, bound by honor. But a kingdom is only as strong as those who defend it. Arthur sought out the greatest warriors of the land, men who could uphold his ideals and defend his throne. They would not serve as mere soldiers, nor as power-hungry lords vying for favor. They would be brothers in arms. They would be the Knights of the Round Table. For all its shining ideals, Camelot was not built on Arthur alone. The heart of his kingdom beat in the men who rode beside him, those who raised their swords in his name and upheld the code of chivalry. The Knights of the Round Table were warriors, heroes, and at times tragic figures, men of greatness, but also of flaws. Some were legends in their own right, their names spoken in reverence. Others were haunted by their own demons, carrying burdens too heavy even for the strongest knights. The number of Knights of the Round Table varies depending on different versions of the Arthurian legends, ranging from 12 knights to 150 and even 366 in later legends. However, 12 knights commonly stand out from the rest. Sir Lancelot. No knight in Arthur's court was more feared in battle or more admired than Sir Lancelot de Lac. Tall, broad-shouldered, with sharp, piercing blue eyes and a face that seemed carved from noble lineage itself, Lancelot was the very image of a warrior king, despite never claiming a throne of his own. His hair was dark as midnight, often tousled from battle, or damp with sweat from training, and his presence carried an air of effortless command. His origins were steeped in mystery and magic. He was raised not in a castle, but in the mystical waters of the Lady of the Lake, a figure beyond mortal time who had chosen him for something greater. Under her guidance, he became a warrior without equal, moving like a shadow on the battlefield, his sword striking with precision that seemed almost inhuman. His armor gleamed like silver under the sun, and no knight could best him in single combat. Lancelot was not only Camelot's strongest sword, but also its most honorable heart, at least for a time. He was noble, fiercely loyal, yet burdened by a quiet melancholy. His sense of duty was absolute, his devotion to Arthur unshakable, until he fell in love with Queen Guinevere. Sir Gawain. A man of fire and fury, Sir Gawain was Arthur's most relentless warrior, a figure who inspired both admiration and fear. His hair was a deep auburn, his beard thick, his eyes sharp with a fiery green hue that held the wild spirit of his bloodline. He was not a knight of quiet honor, but of fierce loyalty, driven by duty, and a heart that burned with passion. He was Arthur's nephew, the eldest son of King Lot and Morgause, making him Mordred's half-brother. Though lesser in nobility than some of the other knights, Gawain carved his place through sheer will and strength. No knight charged into battle faster, and none fought with greater ferocity. But Gawain carried a secret, an enchantment that made him nearly invincible. His strength grew with the rising sun, doubling each morning and reaching its peak at noon, making him unstoppable in battle. But as the sun descended, so did his power, leaving him vulnerable when darkness fell. Though fiercely loyal to Arthur, Gawain's temper often ruled him, making him reckless. He bore grudges, none more severe than his hatred for Lancelot, whom he never forgave for the affair with Guinevere. Sir Galahad. If Lancelot was the greatest knight in battle, then Sir Galahad, his son, was the greatest in spirit. With golden hair and strikingly pure, almost unearthly features, Galahad was unlike any knight who had ever lived. He was tall and slender, graceful rather than powerful, his movements effortless, as if guided by something divine. His eyes, a piercing silver blue, held no trace of doubt or fear. Born of Lancelot and Elaine of Corbenic, Galahad was marked by fate from birth. He wore armor as white as morning frost, his cloak unstained by blood or sin. He never faltered, never strayed, and no earthly temptation could sway him. He was the only knight worthy of the Holy Grail. Sir Tristan. Tall, lean, and battle-hardened, Sir Tristan of Lyonesse was a warrior shaped by sorrow. His dark hair was streaked with the sun's burn from years at sea, his face marked with the quiet pain of a man who had loved too deeply. His skill with the sword was second only to Lancelot, and his mind was as sharp as the blade he carried. Tristan's tragedy was love itself. Tasked with escorting Princess Isolde of Ireland to her marriage with King Mark of Cornwall, Tristan did his duty, but a cruel trick of fate, a love potion meant for Isolde and Mark, bound him and Isolde to each other, heart and soul. Their affair was doomed from the start. When King Mark discovered their betrayal, Tristan was banished, forced to roam the lands in exile. He fought, he wandered, he tried to outrun fate. But fate does not forget. Wounded by a poisoned blade, Tristan sent for Isolde, knowing only she could save him. A ship was to bring her, carrying white sails if she had come, black if she had not. But Tristan's jealous wife, seeing a chance for revenge, lied. She told him the sails were black. Tristan died believing Isolde had abandoned him. When she arrived and saw his lifeless body, she laid herself beside him, and her heart broke. She followed him into death. Camelot had many knights, but none knew heartbreak as deeply as Tristan. Sir Kay. Not all knights were bound for tragedy. Some, like Sir Kay, were warriors through and through, loyal, brash, and utterly unshakable. Tall, broad, with a perpetual smirk, Kay was Arthur's foster brother, raised alongside him before Arthur ever knew he was a king. His tongue was sharper than any blade, his wit as quick as his sword. He was a man of great strength, though not as skilled as Lancelot or Tristan, and he had a habit of mocking his opponents before crushing them. Kay was not always the noblest knight, nor the most honorable. but his loyalty to Arthur was absolute. When others fell to temptation, Kay remained steadfast. He was the king's shield, and though history does not always remember him, Arthur never rode into battle without him. Sir Bedivere, the last knight to stand beside Arthur, the last to see the king alive, Sir Bedivere was a warrior of quiet strength, his long black hair streaked with gray from years of battle, his eyes shadowed with the weight of duty. When Arthur fell at Camlan, it was Bedivere who carried him from the field. It was Bedivere who was given Arthur's final command, to return Excalibur to the Lady of the Lake. And as Arthur's body was carried to Avalon, Bedivere stood alone, the last knight of Camelot. Sir Percival. Sir Percival was unlike many of the hardened warriors of the Round Table. He was not raised in a noble court, nor was he trained in battle from a young age. Instead, he grew up in the wilds, sheltered by his mother, who sought to keep him away from the dangers of knighthood after his father and brothers had been slain in battle. Because of this, he entered Camelot as an innocent, a young man unpolished in the ways of war and courtly life, but pure of heart and untainted by the corruption of men. Percival was often depicted as youthful, with fair hair and bright eyes full of wonder. He was clad in simple armor when he first arrived at Arthur's court, a stark contrast to the decorated knights who had fought in countless wars. Yet his natural talent for battle was undeniable, and his heart was unshaken by fear or ambition. He was a man who saw the world in absolutes, good and evil, right and wrong, without the cynicism of those who had been long entrenched in politics and bloodshed. His greatest tale came during the quest for the Holy Grail. Percival was among the first to witness the sacred relic, but due to his lack of understanding, he failed to ask the right questions when presented with the Grail. Because of this, he initially lost his chance to claim it. However, his unwavering faith and determination led him back to the Grail in later versions of the story, where he was finally deemed worthy. Sir Bors the Younger. Sir Bors was a man of contradictions, fiercely loyal to his family, yet devoted to a higher calling that often put him at odds with them. He was the son of King Bors of Gaul and the cousin of Lancelot, sharing his bloodline's legendary prowess in battle. Yet while Lancelot was torn by passion and personal conflict, Bors was defined by his discipline and devotion to a greater cause. A broad-shouldered, formidable warrior, Bors had a weathered look even in his youth. His hair was dark, his eyes sharp, and his expression often carried the weight of duty. Though his sword was swift, his greatest strength was his unshakable faith, both in God and in the ideals of chivalry. He was known for wearing a simple white surcoat over his armor, symbolizing his purity of purpose. During the quest for the Holy Grail, Bors was one of only 3 knights who achieved the sacred relic, alongside Percival and Galahad. Unlike Galahad, who was lifted into heaven upon finding the Grail, and Percival, who vanished into obscurity, Bors returned to Camelot, a man who had glimpsed divinity and yet chose to remain among the broken world of men. Despite his deep faith, Bors was also a man of fierce loyalty. Even when Lancelot's affair with Guinevere was revealed and the Round Table was torn apart, Bors stood by his cousin. He fought at Lancelot's side against Arthur's forces, despite knowing that the kingdom they once swore to protect was crumbling around them. In the end, after Arthur's death, Bors joined Lancelot in a life of penance, traveling to the Holy Land, where he is said to have met his end fighting in battle, seeking redemption perhaps for the part he played in Camelot's fall. Sir Lamorak. Sir Lamorak was one of the greatest warriors to ever sit at the Round Table, bold, fearless, and nearly unmatched in combat. He was the son of King Pellinore, a great knight in his own right, and he inherited his father's strength and fierce sense of justice. Lamorak was known for his fiery red hair, his imposing stature, and his powerful build, making him a knight feared on the battlefield. He was the kind of warrior who did not hesitate, who struck first and asked questions later, and whose pride often bordered on arrogance. Lamorak's greatest flaw was his entanglement in a blood feud that would lead to his downfall. His father, Pellinore, had slain King Lot of Orkney in battle, an act that earned the eternal hatred of Lot's sons, Gawain, Agravain, Gaheris, and Mordred. While Arthur sought to unite his knights under a single brotherhood, the Orkney brothers never forgave Pelinor's line. Despite this animosity, Lamorak did not shy away from provocation. He even took Queen Morgause, King Lot's widow and the mother of Gawain, as his lover, an act that enraged the Orkney brothers further. Though some stories paint this as love, others suggest it was a deliberate insult, an attempt to assert dominance over his enemies. The rivalry came to a bloody end when Gaheris caught Lamorak with his mother and murdered Morgause in a fit of rage. Not long after, Gawain and his brothers ambushed Lamorak, slaughtering him while he was unarmed. It was not an honorable duel, nor was it a battle between equals. Lamorak was simply cut down, a victim of the same endless cycle of vengeance that would one day consume Camelot itself. Sir Gareth. If Sir Gawain was a knight of fire and fury, his younger brother Gareth was his opposite. He was a knight of patience, of humility, of quiet strength that did not need to be proven. Gareth was the youngest son of King Lot of Orkney, raised under the shadow of his older brothers, Gawain, Agravain, Gaheris, and Mordred. Unlike them, he had no thirst for vengeance, no interest in the blood feuds that had defined his family. Gareth was tall and strong, but where his brothers carried an air of menace, he carried warmth. He had golden hair and a youthful face, and he was known for his kindness and courtesy. When he arrived at Camelot, he did not reveal his noble birth. Instead, he disguised himself and worked in the kitchens under the name Bowman, meaning fair hands. He toiled in silence, enduring insults and ridicule, until he had proven himself worthy of knighthood. When his true identity was revealed, Gareth quickly became one of Arthur's most beloved knights. He was known for his chivalry, for showing mercy even to his enemies, and for his devotion to his beloved Lady Lynette. Yet despite all his goodness, Gareth's fate was cruel. During the fallout of Lancelot and Guinevere's affair, Gareth, ever loyal to Arthur, refused to take sides in the growing conflict. But when Lancelot stormed Camelot to rescue Guinevere from execution, Gareth and his brother Gaheris were caught in the chaos. Unarmed and unprepared, they were slaughtered, cut down by none other than Lancelot himself. It was an accident, a tragedy that would forever haunt Lancelot, but it was also the moment that sealed Camelot's doom. Gawain, upon learning of his youngest brother's death, vowed revenge against Lancelot, setting into motion the final war that would end Arthur's reign. Sir Gaheris. Sir Gaheris was the most overlooked of the Orkney brothers, forever standing in the shadow of his elder brother Gawain. Unlike Gawain, who was bold and temperamental, and Agravain, who was cruel and scheming, Gaheris was quiet, observant, and pragmatic. He was a man of duty rather than passion, content to follow rather than to lead. He was not the strongest knight nor the most famous, but he was one of the most cunning. He served as Arthur's enforcer, the knight who did what needed to be done, even when others hesitated. Yet for all his loyalty, Gaheris was capable of terrible violence. His most infamous act was the murder of his own mother, Morgause, after she was discovered in an affair with Sir Lamorak. His fate was entwined with Gareth's. Both were slain by Lancelot in the chaos of Guinevere's rescue, and his death, though overshadowed by Gareth's, was yet another piece of the puzzle that led to Camelot's destruction. Gaheris was not a knight who sought glory, nor was he one who was celebrated in song, but his presence was felt in every war, every betrayal, and every tragedy that defined the fall of Arthur's kingdom. Sir Mordred. And then there was Mordred, Arthur's own blood, yet the one who would bring Camelot to ruin. Born of treachery, his existence was foretold in prophecy, a child who would destroy Arthur's kingdom. Some say he was Arthur's illegitimate son, conceived unknowingly with his own half-sister, Morgause, making him both a son and a nephew. Others claim he was simply an ambitious knight eager to seize power. Regardless, Mordred was Arthur's doom. When Camelot was at its weakest, when Arthur rode to war against Lancelot, Mordred struck. He seized the throne, declared himself king, and shattered the Round Table. More on this later. The Knights of the Round Table were not just warriors, they were brothers, rivals, lovers, and betrayers. Some would be remembered for their honor, others for their sins. But in the end, they were human, and perhaps that was why Camelot was destined to fall. Hey everyone, just a quick intermission here. I wanted to say thank you for watching this video. It really means a lot to me. Did you know that over 80% of you who are watching right now aren't subscribed to the channel? If you've enjoyed this content so far, it would be incredible if you could hit that subscribe button. It's a small gesture, but it really helps the channel grow and ensures that you won't miss any more of our fascinating stories we explore together. Also, if you're feeling generous, please give this video a thumbs up, leave a comment, and share with anyone else who may enjoy it. Your support really does make a difference and keeps the content coming. Thanks again, and let's get back to the story. The Knights of the Round Table were more than warriors. They were more than men with swords who rode into battle at Arthur's command. They were meant to be something greater, the living embodiment of honor, justice, and the ideals that Camelot stood for. But ideals are fragile things. At its height, the Round Table was more than a council. It was a code, a promise. The knights swore to defend the weak, uphold justice, and serve Arthur's vision for a united Britain. They would not fight for personal gain or conquest, but for the higher cause of chivalry. It was a noble dream, and for a time it worked. To become a Knight of the Round Table was no simple feat. Arthur did not allow just anyone to claim a seat. Knighthood was earned, not given. Before taking his place, each knight swore an oath, one that defined the very essence of Camelot: to never commit murder or treason, to always protect the helpless, to never be cruel and always offer mercy, to never fight for personal gain but only in the name of justice, to be humble in victory and gracious in defeat, to be loyal to their lord, their comrades, and the ideals of chivalry. These were the rules that bound the Round Table together. These were the words that made Camelot something more than just another kingdom. But no matter how strong the oath, men are still men. And even the greatest knights found it difficult to live up to the legends they were meant to be. One of the most crucial roles of the knights was protecting the realm. Arthur's Britain was not a land of peace, not truly. Enemies lurked beyond its borders, warlords schemed in the shadows, and creatures of dark magic still roamed the land. The Knights of the Round Table were not just advisors or warriors of legend. They were the shield that stood between Camelot and chaos. Whenever a kingdom threatened war, Arthur's knights rode to meet them. When a nobleman's lands were invaded, Camelot's warriors answered the call. From Saxon raiders to rebel lords, from ambitious kings to monstrous foes, the Knights of the Round Table stood on the front lines of every battle. Some, like Lancelot and Gawain, were commanders in their own right, leading armies in Arthur's name. Others, like Tristan and Percival, were sent on more personal quests, hunting down threats that could not be met with armies alone. But not all battles were fought with swords. The Round Table was not just about war. The knights did not exist only to fight. They were meant to be symbols of virtue, seeking out justice and proving themselves through acts of heroism. Arthur did not command his knights to remain at court, waiting for trouble to come to them. Instead, he encouraged them to ride into the unknown, seeking out injustice wherever it could be found. And so the Knights of Camelot became wanderers as much as warriors. Some knights sought glory, others sought redemption, but all of them sought to become something greater than themselves. Camelot was built on law, not just strength. Arthur's vision for Britain was not one of conquest, but of order, a land where even the greatest noble was held to the same standard as the lowliest peasant. But laws mean nothing without those willing to enforce them. The Knights of the Round Table acted as judges and mediators, settling disputes among Arthur's vassals. If a noble was accused of a crime, it was not enough for the word of one man to condemn him. The knights ensured trials were fair, that justice was served without corruption or cruelty. They were not executioners, they were protectors of the innocent, of the kingdom, and of the ideals that Camelot was built upon. Yet justice is never so simple. When the greatest of Arthur's knights broke the very code they had sworn to uphold, the foundation of Camelot itself began to crack. Camelot was not built in peace, and it would never exist without war. Though Arthur had defeated the Saxons, though his kingdom stood strong, there were still enemies beyond his borders, warlords who saw his rise to power as a challenge. And none were more relentless than King Claudas of Gaul. For years, this ruthless conqueror had burned his way through the lands of Ban and Bors, two kings who had once been Arthur's greatest allies. He saw Arthur not as a ruler, but as an obstacle, one that needed to be eliminated before Camelot could become too powerful. But Arthur did not sit idle, and when the call for aid came, the Knights of the Round Table rode to war. The war against Claudas was not won in a day. Unlike Arthur's swift victory over the Saxons, this conflict dragged on for years, bleeding into the lives of the next generation of knights. Claudas was not simply a brute on the battlefield, he was a strategist, a man who fought with deception, using spies, mercenaries, and assassins as much as he did armies. Time and again, his forces ambushed Arthur's allies, burning villages, seizing fortresses, striking before Camelot could react. The young knights, many of whom had never seen war, were tested in ways they never expected. Sir Lancelot, still in his prime, led several crucial battles, proving himself unstoppable with sword in hand. Sir Gawain, driven by vengeance, cut down hundreds of Claudas's men, earning a reputation for ferocity unmatched by any knight of his generation. Sir Bors, a man of faith and honor, led the charge for the fallen kings, seeking to avenge the lands Claudas had stolen. But war changes men. The knights who rode out in glorious banners and shining armor came back scarred, hardened, and filled with the weight of what they had seen. And for Arthur, the war with Claudas marked a turning point, a reminder that no matter how noble his round table was, no matter how great his vision, he was still a king who ruled through bloodshed. King Claudas did not fight fair. Where Arthur fought with chivalry, Claudas fought with deceit. He sent false envoys, tricking Camelot into believing peace was possible, only to ambush Arthur's forces. He bribed lesser lords, ensuring that Arthur's allies turned against him at the worst moments. And in his greatest insult, Claudas captured and tortured several of Arthur's knights, leaving them broken, mutilated, and sent back as warnings. This was no longer just a war for land, it was personal. The knights, men sworn to honor and mercy, began fighting with cruelty of their own. Some abandoned their oaths, choosing vengeance over justice. Others questioned Arthur's rule, wondering if this war would ever end. It was a stain upon Camelot's legacy, one that could never fully be erased. In the end, it was Lancelot who turned the tide. Tired of Claudas's games, he led a relentless campaign, striking deep into enemy territory. One by one, Claudas' fortresses fell, his mercenaries abandoned him, and his forces were scattered across Gaul. The final battle came at Roche-au-Moine, a fortress where Claudas made his last stand. Lancelot, in a rage unlike any the knights had ever seen, tore through Claudas's men, cutting down any who stood in his way. When the dust settled, Claudas was no longer a king. He was a defeated man, fleeing into exile, his kingdom in ruins. Camelot had won, but the cost was high. The Knights of the Round Table were not the same. Some had grown disillusioned. Others had become colder, crueler, less bound by their oaths. And for Arthur, the dream of Camelot no longer seemed so pure. Because if even his best knights could fall to vengeance and war, then what hope did his kingdom truly have? For all its triumphs, for all the battles fought and won, Camelot was never meant to last. The cracks had always been there, waiting to spread, and when the Holy Grail appeared, everything changed. Perhaps the most famous tale involving the Knights of the Round Table, the Grail was no mere cup. It was a relic of divine power, said to hold the blood of Christ himself. To drink from it was to be granted knowledge beyond human comprehension, perhaps even eternal life. But it was not an object that could be claimed by just anyone. Only the purest of heart, the most worthy of knights, could even hope to find it. And so, when the Grail revealed itself in a vision, it was not just a quest, it was a test. Arthur's court had grown restless. The golden age of Camelot was beginning to tarnish, its knights growing weary, its king distracted by unseen shadows. And so, when the call came, it was welcomed. A purpose, a final glorious mission. One by one, Arthur's best knights swore to seek the Grail, believing that their strength, their honor, their very existence had been leading to this moment. But the quest was a cruel thing. The Grail did not offer easy paths or simple victories. It sent the knights wandering through treacherous lands, where faith was tested, where even the most noble among them found themselves questioning everything they had once believed. Many never returned. Some died in battle. Some lost themselves entirely, fading into legend, their names swallowed by time. Others, broken and ashamed, crawled back to Camelot empty-handed, haunted by what they had seen. Only 3 knights succeeded: Sir Bors, Sir Percival, and Sir Galahad. Bors was a man of duty, one who had resisted every temptation along the way. He had seen horrors, had watched his brothers fall, but he had never lost himself. Percival was the seeker, the one who had come closest to true enlightenment. But it was Galahad, the son of Lancelot, the knight untouched by sin, who achieved what no one else could. He was the only one deemed worthy of the Grail's ultimate gift. As he drank, a light surrounded him, and with a final knowing smile he ascended to the heavens. He had found perfection, and in doing so, had left the mortal world behind. Camelot had won, but at what cost? Arthur's court had been hollowed out. The best of his knights were gone, dead, missing, or forever changed. The unity that had once bound them was shattered. The Grail had promised salvation, but all it had left was emptiness. And in that emptiness, the seeds of Camelot's fall took root. When the knights first left, Arthur had watched them go with pride. When they returned, those few who did, he barely recognized them. The world outside Camelot had changed them, and they had brought that change back with them. They spoke of visions, of truths that made old loyalties feel like dust. They no longer looked at Arthur as they once had. And then there was Lancelot. He had not gone on the quest. He had stayed behind, his own sins keeping him from the Grail. And with so many knights gone, with so much silence filling the halls of Camelot, he had found himself drawn to the one thing that had always pulled him from his path: Guinevere. For years, the love between Lancelot and Guinevere had been a carefully guarded secret, spoken of in hushed tones, suspected but never proven. Arthur, whether through denial or willful ignorance, had chosen not to confront it. Perhaps he had hoped it would fade. Perhaps he simply could not bear to face what it would mean. But not everyone in Camelot was so blind. Sir Agravain, Arthur's own nephew, had always been a man of ambition. Unlike his brother Gawain, whose loyalty to Arthur never wavered, Agravain saw the world differently. He resented Lancelot, envied his glory, and despised Guinevere for the hold she had over the king. But more than anything, he saw an opportunity. If he could expose the affair, if he could break the trust between Arthur and his most beloved knight, then the kingdom would be his to shape. And so, with the help of Mordred, Agravain set his plan in motion. Another popular version of the story is that Morgan Le Fay exposes the affair to Arthur rather than Sir Agravain. Regardless, the result is the same. One night, they gathered a group of knights and laid a trap. Lancelot had been seen entering Guinevere's chambers before, but there had never been proof. This time, they would make sure there was no doubt. They waited until the moment was right, then stormed in. There was no time to deny it, no time to escape. Lancelot, caught in the one sin he could never erase, did what he did best. He fought. In the chaos, he cut down several of Arthur's knights, including Agravain himself, before escaping into the night. But the damage was done. Arthur had no choice. His queen had betrayed him. His best knight had killed his men. The laws of Camelot were clear. Guinevere had to be punished. The sentence was death by burning. The king gave the order, but his heart was already breaking. The day of the execution arrived, and as Guinevere stood bound before the flames, the court watched in silence. But before the fire could be lit, Lancelot returned, not as a fugitive, but as a warrior. He and his loyal knights cut through the executioners, rescuing Guinevere and fleeing into exile. Arthur, torn between love and duty, had no choice. He could not let such a betrayal stand. He declared war on Lancelot. Camelot was no longer a kingdom united. It was a battlefield waiting to be stained with the blood of its own knights. The war between Arthur and Lancelot was not one of honor, nor of justice. It was a war of grief. Arthur, for all his wisdom, had never known how to handle betrayal, and Lancelot, despite all his strength, could not undo what had been done. Their armies clashed, once brothers, now enemies, and with each battle, the dream of Camelot faded. But while Arthur was distracted, fighting a war he never wanted, Mordred made his move. Arthur had left Camelot in his nephew's hands. He had trusted him to rule in his absence, but Mordred had never wanted to be Arthur's servant. He wanted to be his replacement. And so, while the king was away, Mordred declared himself the rightful ruler of Britain. He took the throne. He gathered those who resented Arthur's rule, and when the time came, he raised his own army against his uncle. Arthur, hearing of Mordred's betrayal, knew what had to be done. The war with Lancelot was forgotten. The real battle was ahead. The final battle. At Camlan, everything would end. The sky was heavy with storm clouds, as if the land itself knew what was coming. Camlan was not just another battlefield. It was the place where dreams died, where legends ended, where the last embers of Camelot's golden age would be snuffed out beneath the weight of betrayal. Arthur rode at the head of his army, his face carved from stone. This was not the war he had imagined when he first took the throne, not the glorious battle of knights and honor. This was a reckoning, a fight to the death between a king and the son who had sworn to destroy him. Across the field, Mordred stood waiting. He wore the crown he had stolen, his sword glinting like a viper's fang. Arthur had once tried to guide him, to shape him into something greater. Now, all he could do was put an end to what he had created. The battle began at dawn. There were no speeches, no negotiations, no last attempts at peace. Only blood and steel, the crash of swords against shields, the cries of dying men. Arthur's knights fought with the fury of men who knew this was their final stand. Gawain was already gone, slain in the war against Lancelot, and many others had fallen before this day ever began. The Round Table, once the heart of Camelot, was shattered beyond repair. Mordred's forces were ruthless, but Arthur's knights were desperate. They pushed forward, cutting through the traitors' ranks, fighting not for victory, but for vengeance. Camelot was already lost. This was about justice, about ensuring that whatever came next, Mordred would not be there to see it. Hours passed. The field was slick with mud and blood. And then, at last, Arthur saw him. Mordred stood alone, his men either dead or fleeing. The king did not hesitate. He charged, Excalibur raised high, ready to bring the blade down and end this nightmare once and for all. Mordred did not run. He met his father's charge head-on, his own sword striking out like lightning. The clash was deafening. Excalibur found its mark first. It drove through Mordred's armor, piercing his heart, ending his treachery in a single brutal instant. But even in death, Mordred had his revenge. With the last of his strength, he thrust his blade forward, driving it deep into Arthur's side. The king staggered, the world tilted. He had won, but at a cost too great to bear. Mordred collapsed, his hand still clutching the sword's hilt. Arthur fell to his knees, Excalibur slipping from his grasp. Around him, what little remained of his knights began to realize what had happened. The battle was over, the war was won, but their king was dying. The few knights who remained carried Arthur from the field, their hands slick with his blood. They knew there was only one place left for him now. Avalon. After the Battle of Camlan, the Round Table, the brotherhood that had once been the heart of Camelot, was no more. Some knights died alongside Arthur, some vanished into exile, and a few lived on, haunted by the kingdom they could not save. Sir Bedivere was among the few who survived Camlan. As Arthur lay dying, he gave his final order: return Excalibur to the Lady of the Lake. Bedivere hesitated, twice. He could not bring himself to cast the legendary sword away, but on the third attempt, he finally hurled Excalibur into the waters, where a pale hand rose from the lake and took it beneath the surface. Afterward, Bedivere witnessed Arthur's body being carried away to Avalon. Whether the king died or still waits for Britain's darkest hour is unknown. With Arthur gone and Camelot destroyed, Bedivere became a hermit, wandering the land in sorrow. Some say he lived out his days in a monastery, praying for the soul of his fallen king. Sir Lancelot, once the greatest of all Arthur's knights, was not at Camlan. He had fled after rescuing Guinevere from execution, which had set off the final war between himself and Arthur. By the time he returned, Arthur was already dead. Heartbroken, Lancelot sought out Guinevere, but she had taken vows as a nun, believing herself unworthy of forgiveness. Lancelot followed her example, becoming a monk, devoting the rest of his life to penance. Years later, he had a vision of Guinevere's death. He rushed to her convent, arriving just in time to witness her final breath. After burying her beside King Arthur, Lancelot himself died soon after, overcome with grief and fasting. Sir Bors, one of the 3 knights who found the Holy Grail, was among the last surviving members of the Round Table. Unlike Lancelot, he did not turn to a life of solitude. Instead, he returned to Arthur's side in the final war, only to see Camelot fall apart. After Camlan, Bors traveled to the Holy Land, seeking one last great quest. He is said to have died on a crusade, fighting in a land far from the kingdom he once served. Sir Percival, another Grail knight, had already withdrawn from the world before Camlan. After witnessing the divine power of the Grail, he chose a life of isolation, never returning to Camelot. Some say he became a wandering holy man, others claim he disappeared entirely, vanishing into legend. With Arthur dead, his best knights gone, and the Round Table shattered, Camelot could not survive. The kingdom collapsed into chaos, torn apart by rival warlords and invaders. No successor could hold it together. Some say Arthur will return one day, that the once and future king still sleeps in Avalon, waiting for Britain's darkest hour. But the Knights of the Round Table? Their time was over. Their legend remains, but they themselves, those who had once sworn to build a kingdom of honor, faded into history, their names spoken only in myths and legends.